They say Oregon is a place of natural beauty, towering forests, misty coastlines, and mountains that touch the sky. But beneath that picturesque surface lies something far darker, something that doesn't appear on any tourist map. Tonight, I'm taking you deep into the shadows of the Pacific Northwest, where the trees whisper secrets that should never be told, and where ordinary people encountered horrors that defy explanation. These aren't just stories. These are warnings. Warnings from those who survived to tell the tale, and tributes to those who didn't. If you're easily unsettled, now's your chance to turn back. But if you're brave enough to continue, make sure you're watching with the lights on, because after tonight, you'll never look at Oregon the same way again. Are you ready? Then let's begin. Before we dive into our first terrifying tale, if you love true horror stories that will keep you up at night, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a nightmare. Trust me, you'll want to be here for what's coming next. Michael Chen had always considered himself a rational man. A software engineer from Portland, he lived his life according to logic, data, and provable facts. The supernatural was nothing more than entertainment to him. Campfire stories and Hollywood fiction. That perspective would be forever shattered during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip to Crater Lake in the summer of 2019. He had chosen Crater Lake for its reputation as one of Oregon's most stunning natural wonders. The deepest lake in the United States, formed nearly 8,000 years ago when Mount Mazama collapsed. It was a place of extraordinary beauty. The water was so blue it seemed almost artificial, and the surrounding cliffs created a natural amphitheater that made visitors feel both insignificant and privileged to witness such majesty. Michael arrived on a Friday evening in late July, just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. He had secured a backcountry permit for a more isolated camping experience, wanting to escape not just the city, but also the crowds of tourists that flocked to the more popular camping areas. His chosen spot was on the eastern shore, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense forest before opening up to a small, rocky beach. The first night passed without incident. Michael set up his tent, cooked a simple meal over his portable stove, and spent the evening reading by flashlight. The stillness of the lake was profound. No motors were allowed on the water, and at this distance from the main visitor areas, even human voices were absent. There was only the occasional whisper of wind through the trees and the gentle lapping of water against stone. It was around 2:30 a.m. when Michael first heard it, a sound that pulled him from sleep so abruptly that his heart was already racing before his mind fully understood he was awake. It was a splash, but not like anything he'd heard before. Too large to be a fish, too deliberate to be a falling rock. And it was close, maybe 40 or 50 feet from shore. Michael lay in his sleeping bag, holding his breath, listening. For several minutes, there was nothing but silence. He had almost convinced himself he'd imagined it, or that it had been part of a dream, when he heard it again. Another splash, this time accompanied by something else, a sound that his brain struggled to categorize. It was almost like breathing, but wet and labored, as if something was surfacing after being underwater for far too long. He grabbed his flashlight and slowly unzipped his tent. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rocky beach and the obsidian surface of the water beyond. Nothing. Just the vast expanse of the lake reflecting starlight, perfectly still now, as if mocking his fear. Michael was about to retreat back into his tent when he saw the ripples. They were moving toward the shore in concentric circles, emanating from a point just beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. Something had just submerged, something large. Sleep became impossible. Michael spent the rest of the night sitting at the entrance of his tent, flashlight in hand, watching the water. As dawn broke and golden light spilled over the caldera rim, painting the cliffs in shades of amber and rose, his fear seemed ridiculous. In the morning light, Crater Lake was once again simply beautiful, serene, and utterly ordinary. He decided to stay another night. He was being irrational, he told himself. There were no large animals in Crater Lake. The ecosystem was too isolated, too specific. The lake had been studied extensively. He knew what was in there. Kokanee salmon, rainbow trout, crayfish. Nothing that could account for what he'd heard. That day, Michael hiked along the shore, exploring the volcanic rock formations and taking photographs. He encountered a park ranger around midday, a weathered woman in her 50s named Diane, who was checking on backcountry campers. "How's your stay been?" she asked, her tone friendly but professional. "Great," Michael lied. "Heard some interesting wildlife last night, though. Large splashing sounds. Any idea what that might have been?" Something flickered across Diane's face, so quick that Michael almost missed it. Her smile became slightly more fixed, slightly less genuine. Crater Lake can play tricks on you at night. Sound travels strangely over the water. Probably just rocks falling from the cliffs or your mind playing games in the dark. Happens to a lot of people out here alone. "Right," Michael said, though her response felt rehearsed, like she'd given it many times before. Diane lingered a moment longer than seemed necessary. "You're heading out tomorrow?" she asked. "That was the plan." Good. She nodded, already turning to continue her patrol. Then she paused and looked back at him. "If you hear anything else tonight, stay in your tent. Don't go investigating. Some things are better left alone." The way she said it, the sudden seriousness in her voice, sent a chill down Michael's spine despite the warm afternoon sun. "What do you mean?" But Diane was already walking away, raising a hand in farewell without turning around. "Have a safe trip out," she called over her shoulder. That evening, Michael considered packing up and leaving. The ranger's words had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. But the logical part of his brain, the part that had always served him well, insisted he was being foolish. He had paid for the permit. The weather was perfect. He would not be driven away by vague warnings and nighttime noises that probably had mundane explanations. He built a small fire as the sun set, roasted a hot dog, and tried to relax. The lake remained calm, a vast mirror reflecting the deepening blue of twilight. A few stars began to appear, and Michael found himself almost able to forget his unease. Then the sun disappeared entirely, and darkness claimed the caldera. Michael sat by his fire, feeding it sticks to keep the flames alive, pushing back the night. He had decided he would simply stay awake this time, maintaining his vigil until dawn. Then he would pack up and leave, his weekend adventure complete, his rational worldview intact. At 11:47 p.m., the fire died. Not gradually, not from lack of fuel. There were plenty of unburned sticks remaining. It simply went out, all at once, as if something had covered it like a suffocating blanket. The transition from firelight to darkness was so sudden that Michael's eyes hadn't adjusted. He was effectively blind. His hand found his flashlight and clicked it on. The beam illuminated his small campsite, the cold fire pit, the entrance to his tent. Everything looked normal. He swung the beam toward the water. Something was standing in the shallows. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The figure was roughly humanoid in shape, but wrong in every other way. It stood perhaps 7 feet tall. Its skin, if it could be called skin, appeared slick and dark, reflecting the flashlight beam like wet rubber. Its limbs were too long, its proportions alien. Where a head should be was something that suggested a head, but features were impossible to discern in the darkness, as if the thing's face was somehow darker than the night itself. It stood perfectly still, the water around its legs, if they were legs, lapping gently against what might have been knees. Michael could hear it breathing, that same wet, labored sound from the night before, but amplified now, unmistakable. They remained frozen like that. Michael with his flashlight, the thing in the water for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then slowly, deliberately, the figure began to move toward him. Michael ran. He didn't think, didn't plan, didn't grab any of his gear. Pure animal instinct took over. and he crashed into the forest, branches whipping at his face, roots threatening to trip him with every desperate step. The flashlight beam bounced wildly, creating a chaotic strobe effect that made the forest seem to pulse with life. Behind him, he could hear it following. Not running, not crashing through the undergrowth as he was. The sound was more like a smooth gliding, accompanied by that awful breathing and something else, a smell that hit him like a physical force. It was the smell of deep water, of things long drowned, of organic matter decaying in cold darkness. Michael didn't know the trail. He'd only hiked it once in daylight. But fear gave him speed, if not direction. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs threatened to give out, until the sounds of pursuit finally faded behind him. He emerged onto the main road that circled the rim of the caldera just as a pair of headlights rounded the curve. Michael stumbled into the middle of the road, waving his arms frantically. The car, a ranger vehicle, stopped abruptly, and Diane jumped out. "Jesus Christ, what happened?" she demanded, taking in his wild appearance, his torn clothes, the absolute terror in his eyes. "There was... in the water. Something came out of the lake," Michael gasped, his words tumbling over each other. Diane's expression hardened. She grabbed her radio from her belt. "This is Ranger Hastings. We have a code silver at Crater Lake, Eastern Shore area. Request immediate response." She turned back to Michael. "Get in the car, now." As they drove away, Michael looked back toward the forest from which he had emerged, and the edge of the trees, just beyond where the headlights reached, he thought he saw something tall and dark, watching them go. Diane drove him directly to the park headquarters, where 2 other rangers were waiting. They took his statement, their faces carefully neutral, asking specific questions about what he'd seen, when he'd seen it, and exactly where. They retrieved his camping gear the next morning, though they wouldn't let him come along. When his belongings were returned to him, Michael noticed his tent had been torn. Not ripped by branches or worn by use, but torn by something with immense strength. The fabric separated in clean, deliberate slashes. The Rangers didn't say anything about the damage. Before he left, Diane pulled him aside. "There are things in this world that don't fit into neat categories. Things that were here long before us, and will be here long after. Crater Lake is a sacred place. The Klamath tribes have stories about it going back centuries, stories about what lives in the deep water. We don't talk about it publicly because, well, who would believe us? And what good would it do?" "What is it?" Michael asked. Diane shook her head. "I don't know exactly. None of us do. We just know that sometimes, when people camp alone on certain shores, especially the eastern shore, where the water is deepest, they encounter something. Most of the time it just watches. Sometimes it comes closer. And very occasionally..." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. "Has anyone..." Michael couldn't complete the question either. 3 disappearances in the last 40 years. All people who were camping alone, all on the eastern shore. No bodies ever recovered. We search, we investigate, but Crater Lake is 1,943 feet deep. If something doesn't want to be found down there, it won't be." Michael left Oregon the next day and never returned. He moved from Portland to San Diego 6 months later, unable to live so close to those deep, dark waters. He never went camping again. And on quiet nights, when the world is still and he lies awake in the darkness, he sometimes hears it. That wet, labored breathing. And he knows with absolute certainty that some things cannot be explained by logic, data, or provable facts. Some things simply are. That was just the first story, and trust me, it only gets darker from here. If you're feeling that chill down your spine, you're not alone. Drop a comment below telling me if you'd ever camp alone at Crater Lake after hearing this. Now let's move on to our second tale of terror from Oregon.
The Heceta Head Lighthouse stands on a dramatic cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, 12 miles north of Florence, Oregon. Built in 1894, it's considered one of the most photographed lighthouses on the Oregon coast. Its white tower and keeper's house perched 205 feet above the crashing waves below. During the day, it's a picturesque landmark that appears on countless postcards and travel brochures. But at night, when fog rolls in from the ocean and wraps the structure in a suffocating blanket of white, it becomes something else entirely. Sarah Morrison learned this the hard way in October of 2017. She had taken a position as a seasonal caretaker for the lighthouse keeper's house, which had been converted into a bed and breakfast. It was supposed to be a dream job, living in a historic building, surrounded by natural beauty, with duties that included light housekeeping, preparing breakfasts for guests, and giving occasional tours. Sarah, a 32-year-old writer from Eugene, saw it as the perfect opportunity to work on her novel while earning a modest income in an inspirational setting. The previous caretaker, an elderly woman named Margaret, had left abruptly in late September. When Sarah asked why, the lighthouse manager, a brusque man named Thomas Carr, had been vague. She said the isolation didn't agree with her, he'd explained, not meeting Sarah's eyes. Some people can't handle being out here alone, especially in the off-season. Sarah moved in on October 1st. The keeper's house was beautiful, with its Victorian architecture, period furniture, and stunning views of the coastline. Her living quarters were on the second floor, a cozy bedroom with slanted ceilings and a small writing desk positioned by the window. She could see the lighthouse tower from there, its beam sweeping across the water every 10 seconds throughout the night. The first week was peaceful, almost idyllic. Sarah established a routine: wake at dawn, prepare breakfast for the handful of guests staying in the other rooms, clean up, spend the afternoon writing, handle the evening check-ins, then settle into her room with a book or her laptop. The only sounds were the constant rhythm of the waves and the occasional cry of seagulls. On her 8th night, Sarah awoke to the sound of scratching. It was coming from the attic above her bedroom, a persistent, deliberate scraping, as if something with claws was dragging them across the wooden floorboards. Back and forth, with an unsettling regularity that suggested intention rather than random animal movement. Sarah lay in bed, heart pounding, listening. The scratching continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Silence rushed in to fill the void, somehow more oppressive than the sound had been. In the morning, Sarah mentioned it to Thomas when he came by with supplies. "Oh, that's just rats," he said dismissively. "Old building like this, you're gonna have some wildlife. I'll set some traps in the attic." But Sarah had lived in old buildings before. She knew what rats sounded like. Quick, skittering movements, random and chaotic. This had been different, methodical, almost thoughtful. That afternoon, while her guests were out exploring the coast, Sarah decided to investigate the attic herself. The access was through a small door in the hallway ceiling, reached by pulling down a folding ladder. She'd been told the attic was just storage, old furniture, boxes of records, things accumulated over decades of lighthouse operation. The ladder creaked as she climbed. The attic was dark, illuminated only by the weak daylight filtering through a small circular window at the far end. Sarah's flashlight beams swept across dusty furniture, draped in sheets, stacks of water-damaged boxes, and tangles of cobwebs that swayed in the draft. She was about to descend, satisfied that there was nothing unusual, when her flashlight caught something on the floor. Scratch marks. Deep gouges in the wood, concentrated in one area near the circular window. They formed a pattern, not random at all, but deliberate. It took Sarah a moment to recognize what she was looking at. They were words. Someone or something had scratched words into the floor. "Help me. I'm still here." Sarah's blood ran cold. The letters were crude, uneven, but unmistakable. And worse, they looked fresh. The exposed wood was pale, not darkened with age like it should be if this was some historical artifact. She descended the ladder so quickly she nearly fell, and immediately called Thomas. He arrived within 20 minutes, his jaw set in a grim line when she told him what she'd found. "Show me," he said. They climbed to the attic together. Thomas studied the scratched message for a long time, his flashlight beam steady on the gouged wood. Finally, he sighed deeply. "I was hoping you wouldn't find this." "What is it?" Sarah demanded. "Who wrote it?" Thomas sat down heavily on an old trunk. "There's a story about this lighthouse," he began. "It's not in any of the official histories, not in any of the tour scripts. We don't talk about it because, well, it's bad for business. But people who work here, people who stay here for any length of time, they experience things." He told her about Anna, the lighthouse keeper's daughter who, according to legend, died in the attic in the 1890s. She was playing there when she fell from the circular window and broke her neck on the rocks below. Her body was recovered and she was buried in a small cemetery not far from the lighthouse. "But that's just a story," Thomas continued. "What's real is what's been happening here for the last 130 years. Caretakers report seeing a woman in old-fashioned clothing, guests wake to find their belongings rearranged, and the scratching, that's been reported for decades. Margaret, your predecessor, she said she saw something in the attic one night, a figure standing by that window. When she tried to speak to it, it turned toward her and she said it didn't have a face, just darkness where the features should be." Sarah felt sick. "You should have told me this before I took the job." "Would you have taken it if I had?" "Look, I need someone here. The lighthouse can't operate without a caretaker. And honestly, most people never experience anything. You just had bad luck finding that message." But Sarah's bad luck was only beginning.
That night, the scratching returned, louder than before. It went on for hours, stopping only when dawn began to break. Sarah got no sleep. In the morning, she found long scratch marks on her bedroom door. On the inside, as if something had been trying to get out of her room rather than in. She should have left then. Looking back, Sarah would forever wonder why she didn't. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or pride, or simply the writer in her that saw this as material for her novel. Whatever the reason, she stayed. The phenomena escalated. Objects moved on their own. Books would be on different shelves than where she'd left them. Dishes would be in wrong cabinets. Her clothes would be pulled from her dresser and laid out on the bed in old-fashioned arrangements. Once, she came back from grocery shopping to find every mirror in the house turned toward the wall. The guests began to complain. They reported hearing crying at night, seeing shadows pass by their doors, feeling sudden cold spots in the hallways. One couple checked out in the middle of the night, refusing to explain what they'd seen, refusing a refund, just desperate to leave. On the 15th night, Sarah woke to find someone standing at the foot of her bed. It was a woman in a long, dark dress, her hair hanging limp around her shoulders. She stood perfectly still, watching Sarah with eyes that reflected the moonlight like an animal's. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't scream. She could only stare back at this impossible figure, her mind trying to process what she was seeing. The woman raised one hand slowly and pointed toward the attic. Her mouth opened and a sound emerged. Not words exactly, but a desperate, pleading moan that seemed to come from somewhere deep and hollow. Then she simply faded, like a photograph left in the sun, until nothing remained but shadows and moonlight. Sarah spent the rest of the night with all her lights on, sitting at her desk, her phone in her hand, debating whether to call someone, anyone, or if that would just make her seem crazy. When dawn finally came, she made a decision. She would go to the attic one more time. She would find out what this entity wanted, and then she would leave, job or no job. She climbed to the attic as morning light streamed through the circular window. The scratched message was still there, but now there was more. Fresh marks, carved sometime during the night, extending from the original message. The rocks. Under the rocks. Set me free. Sarah descended from the attic, grabbed her coat, and went outside. The lighthouse grounds were extensive, with rocky outcroppings and cliff edges that required careful navigation. She worked her way down the steep path that led toward the shoreline, to the area directly below the attic window. It took her 2 hours of searching, moving stones and examining the cliff face before she found it. Behind a cluster of large rocks, partially hidden by coastal brush, was a small fissure in the cliff, and wedged into that fissure, almost completely obscured, was something that made Sarah's stomach turn. Bones. Small bones. A child's bones. She called the police immediately. They arrived with the county coroner and a team of forensic specialists. The recovery took most of the day. Sarah watched from a distance as they carefully extracted the remains and documented everything with cameras and measurements. The coroner confirmed what Sarah had already suspected. The bones belonged to a young girl, approximately 8 to 10 years old, and they had been there for a very long time, over a century, based on their condition and the geological evidence. There was damage to the skull consistent with a fall from a significant height. This matches the legend about Anna, the lead investigator told Sarah later. According to the story, Anna fell from the lighthouse keeper's house. They found a body and buried it, but he gestured toward the cliff. Maybe they found the wrong body? Maybe what they buried wasn't her, or maybe they were two accidents. We may never know for sure. The bones were removed and given a proper burial in the local cemetery. A small ceremony was held, attended by Sarah, Thomas, and a few local historians who'd taken an interest in the case. As they lowered the small casket into the ground, Sarah felt a strange sensation, as if something heavy that had been pressing down on her chest for weeks was suddenly lifted. That night, the lighthouse keeper's house was silent. No scratching, no moving objects, no apparitions at the foot of the bed. Sarah slept soundly for the first time since she'd arrived, and when she woke the next morning, the house felt different, lighter, at peace. She went to the attic one final time. The scratched messages were still there, carved into the floorboards. But now, there was something else. In the dust near the circular window, as if traced by a finger, were two words: "Thank you." Sarah completed her contract as caretaker, and the remaining weeks passed without incident. The guests stopped complaining. The house felt just like a house again, beautiful and historic, but no longer haunted by a century-old tragedy. Before she left in December, Sarah wrote down everything that had happened. She gave the account to Thomas, who filed it away with other documents in the lighthouse archives. She also finished her novel, though she changed it significantly, incorporating elements of her experience in ways that she hoped honored what had happened without exploiting it. The Heceta Lighthouse still operates today, and the keeper's house still welcomes guests. If you ask the current staff about ghosts, they'll smile and tell you the stories, presenting them as local folklore, entertaining legends to enhance the historical atmosphere. Most of them are new and don't know what Sarah knows, that sometimes the dead don't rest because they can't. Sometimes they're lost, misplaced by history, waiting decades or centuries for someone to hear their plea and give them the peace they deserve. Some hauntings aren't meant to terrify. Some are just desperate attempts to be found. 2 stories down and 1 to go, and I promise you, the final tale is the most disturbing of them all. If you're still with me, you're braver than most. Hit that like button if these stories are getting under your skin. It helps more people find these tales. Now, let's journey into our final nightmare from the shadows of Oregon. The Tillamook State Forest covers over 364,000 acres of dense woodland in the northern Oregon Coast Range. It's a place of towering Douglas firs, winding trails, and an almost prehistoric stillness that makes visitors feel like they've stepped back in time. Hikers, campers, and nature enthusiasts flock to the forest year-round, drawn by its raw beauty and the promise of solitude. But there are parts of Tillamook that even experienced outdoorsmen avoid. sections of the forest where the trees grow so thick that sunlight barely penetrates, where the silence is so complete it feels like a physical presence, and where people who venture too deep sometimes come back changed, if they come back at all. James Whitmore was an experienced wilderness guide. He'd spent 15 years leading groups through Oregon's most challenging terrain, teaching survival skills and helping city dwellers reconnect with nature. At 43 years old, he'd seen black bears, cougars, aggressive elk, and every kind of weather the Pacific Northwest could throw at him. He prided himself on his ability to stay calm in any situation, to assess danger rationally, and to never let fear cloud his judgment. In November of 2018, James was hired by a corporate group for a team-building retreat. 8 executives from a Portland tech company wanted an authentic wilderness experience. 3 days and 2 nights deep in Tillamook Forest with minimal equipment and maximum challenge. James had done dozens of similar trips, and this one seemed straightforward enough. The group was reasonably fit, the weather forecast was clear, and they'd be following established trails for most of the journey. They entered the forest on a Thursday morning, parking at the Wilson River trailhead. The group was in high spirits, joking and taking selfies as James led them into the woods. The plan was to hike 8 miles to a backcountry camping area, spend 2 nights there, and hike back out on Sunday morning. The first day went smoothly. They made good time, stopped for lunch by a creek, and reached the camping area by late afternoon. James helped them set up tents, build a fire, and prepare a simple dinner. As darkness fell and the forest came alive with nocturnal sounds, the executives huddled around the fire, their earlier bravado replaced by a mixture of awe and mild unease at how completely the wilderness surrounded them. James was conducting a final check of the campsite before settling in for the night when he noticed something odd. About 50 yards from their camp, just beyond the firelight's reach, several trees had strange marks on them. He walked over to investigate, his headlamp illuminating the bark. The marks were deep gouges running vertically down the trunks at roughly head height for a tall person. They looked almost like claw marks, but the pattern was wrong for any animal James knew. Bears marked trees, but these gouges were too uniform, too deliberately spaced, and they were on multiple trees, all in a row, as if something had walked along this line marking its territory. He decided not to mention it to the group. No point in making them more nervous than they already were. He returned to camp, added more wood to the fire, and settled into a sleeping bag in his tent. Within an hour, the exhausted executives were all asleep, their soft snoring mixing with the crackling of the dying fire. James woke at 3:17 a.m. to absolute silence. It was the wrongness of the silence that pulled Ovum sleep. Forests are never truly quiet. There are always sounds. Insects, small animals, wind through branches, the settling of wood, something. But now there was nothing. It was as if every living thing in the forest had simultaneously decided to hold its breath. He lay in his tent, listening to the absence of sound, his instinct screaming that something was wrong. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the camp, but the gait was off. The rhythm wasn't quite right. It sounded almost like someone walking on 2 legs, but with a stride that was too long, with feet that fell too heavily, and with a slight dragging sound between steps that James couldn't identify. He slowly unzipped his tent and peered out. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, providing almost no light. His headlamp was in his hand, but some instinct made him reluctant to turn it on. In the dim red glow of the coals, he could see the other tents, their shapes dark and motionless. Everything appeared normal. Then something moved at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, taller than any person, perhaps 7 or 8 feet. He could only see its silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the forest beyond, but that silhouette was wrong. The proportions weren't human. The arms were too long, hanging down past where knees should be. The head seemed oddly small for the body, or perhaps it simply had no neck, the head sitting directly on broad shoulders. and it was watching the camp. James could feel its attention like a physical weight. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, James and the figure remained frozen. The man crouched at his tent entrance, the thing standing at the edge of the forest. Then, slowly, the figure raised one long arm and pointed directly at James's tent. The gesture was unmistakable, deliberate, and somehow more terrifying than any aggressive movement would have been. James did something he'd never done in 15 years of guiding. He retreated back into his tent, zipped it completely, and lay there in the darkness, his heart hammering, telling himself he'd imagined it, that it was a trick of the shadows, that his eyes had deceived him in the poor light. The footsteps resumed, continuing to circle the camp for another 10 minutes. Then, gradually, the normal sounds of the forest returned, a distant owl call, the rustle of leaves, the scurrying of a small animal. Whatever had been there was gone.
James didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn broke and the executives began emerging from their tents, he made a decision. "We're heading back today," he announced. "What? Why?" demanded Marcus, the group's leader. "We paid for 3 days." "Weather's changing," James lied. "There's a storm system moving in faster than predicted. We need to get out before the trails become dangerous." The sky was perfectly clear, and several of the executives pointed this out. But James was insistent. He began breaking down his tent, and his tone made it clear this wasn't open for discussion. Grumbling, the group packed up their gear. As they prepared to leave, James did one more sweep of the area. In the daylight, he found more of those strange marks on trees, but now he could see something else. Tracks. They were in the soft earth near the creek, clear and undeniable. They looked vaguely human. The basic structure was there, but they were enormous, at least 18 inches long, and the toe arrangement was wrong. The big toe was offset, almost like a thumb, and the imprint suggested something with significant weight, but an unusual distribution. James photographed the tracks with his phone, then quickly led the group out. They'd hiked maybe 3 miles, following the trail back toward the trailhead, when one of the executives, a young woman named Beth, grabbed James' arm. "Is someone following us?" she asked quietly. James turned. The trail behind them was empty, winding into the forest between towering trees. "Why do you ask?" "I keep seeing something moving back there," Beth said, pointing, "like someone's pacing us, staying just out of sight." James looked more carefully. At first, he saw nothing. Then, perhaps 100 yards back, he caught a glimpse of movement between the trees. Something tall and dark, moving parallel to the trail, keeping pace with them, but never stepping into the open. "Everyone pick up the pace," James said, his voice calm but firm. "We're going to move a bit faster now." "What's going on?" Marcus demanded. "Just do it," James snapped. They increased their speed from a comfortable height to something closer to a forced march. Behind them, whatever was following matched their pace. Occasionally, one of the executives would glance back and catch a glimpse of that tall, wrongly proportioned silhouette gliding through the trees with an ease that suggested intimate familiarity with the forest. Then they reached a section of the trail that crossed a small ridge. James made a quick calculation. If they could get over the ridge and down the other side quickly, they might be able to break line of sight long enough to gain some distance. He said, "We're going to run. No questions, no arguments. When I say go, you run as fast as you can until we reach the next creek crossing. Ready? Go!" They ran, 8 executives and 1 guide, crashing down the trail with their packs bouncing, their breath coming in gasps, their expensive hiking boots pounding the packed earth. Behind them, James could hear something else running, those same heavy, irregular footsteps, but faster now, accompanied by a sound that might have been breathing or might have been something else entirely. They made it to the creek crossing, splashed through the cold water, and James herded them off the trail and into a dense thicket of undergrowth. "Down! Everyone down and quiet," he whispered harshly. They crouched in the brush, trying to control their breathing, trying to be silent despite their pounding hearts and burning lungs. Through the leaves, they could see the trail they'd just left. The thing emerged from the forest perhaps 30 seconds later. In full daylight, it was somehow worse than it had been in darkness.
It stood at least 7.5 feet tall, its body covered in dark, matted hair that was almost black. Its arms were grotesquely long, the hands hanging down past its knees, and those hands had too many fingers. 6 or 7, James couldn't be sure from this angle. The head was cone-shaped, tapering up from broad shoulders with no visible neck. When it turned, surveying the area, James caught a glimpse of its face and immediately wished he hadn't. It had eyes, that much was clear, but they were set too far apart and seemed to reflect light like an animal's. The nose was flat, almost flush with the face, and the mouth was a wide slash that seemed to stretch too far back toward what should have been ears. When it opened that mouth, testing the air with what might have been scent or might have been something else entirely, James could see teeth that were uniform and peg-like, designed for grinding rather than tearing. The creature stood on the trail for several minutes, its head moving in slow, deliberate sweeps as if scanning for them. Then it did something that made James's blood run cold. It stepped off the trail and walked directly toward their hiding spot. It moved through the forest with disturbing grace, those long arms sometimes touching the ground for balance, sometimes reaching out to steady itself against trees. It was heading straight for them, as if it could sense exactly where they were hiding. James made a split-second decision. He stood up, making himself visible, and shouted, "Hey, over here!" The creature's head snapped toward him with inhuman speed. For a moment, they stared at each other, man and whatever this thing was, across perhaps 20 feet of forest undergrowth. Then James did something insane. He grabbed a large stick and threw it as hard as he could, hitting the creature in what might have been its chest. The thing recoiled, more in surprise than pain, and made a sound, a deep, resonant vocalization that James felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. It was a sound no known animal could make, something between a growl and a horn blast.
"Run!" James screamed at the executives. "Run for the trailhead! Don't stop, don't look back!" They ran. James ran with them, his guide training overriding his terror, keeping himself between the group and the creature. Behind them, that thing was following, no longer hiding, no longer pacing them from the shadows. It was pursuing them openly now, moving through the forest with terrifying speed. The last 3 miles to the trailhead were a nightmare blur. The executives were beyond exhaustion, beyond fear, running on pure adrenaline. 2 of them fell and had to be hauled back to their feet. Marcus twisted his ankle, but kept going, limping badly, supported by 2 colleagues. And behind them, always behind them, they could hear it. The crashing through undergrowth, the heavy breathing, the occasional vocalization that seemed designed to inspire terror. They burst out of the forest into the parking area where their vehicles waited. James fumbled for his keys, got the van doors open, and physically pushed people inside. He did a quick head count, 8 executives, all accounted for, then jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine. As they pulled away, James looked in the rearview mirror. The creature stood at the edge of the forest, perfectly still, watching them leave. In the bright sunlight of the parking area, surrounded by normal reality, cars, a paved lot, a trail information board, its existence seemed impossible. But it was there. They'd all seen it. The drive back to Portland was silent, except for someone's quiet sobbing. When they reached the city, the executives scattered to their homes without even discussing what had happened, as if by not speaking of it, they could convince themselves it hadn't been real. James reported the incident to the Forest Service, showing them the photos he'd taken of the tracks and the tree markings. The response was carefully neutral. They thanked him for his report, added it to a file, and told him they'd investigate. A week later, he received a call telling him that their investigation had found no evidence of any unusual animal activity in the area. The tracks they suggested had probably been bear tracks, distorted by the substrate. The tree markings were likely from elk rubbing their antlers. But James knew what he'd seen. More importantly, he knew he wasn't the first. He began researching and found dozens of reports from Tillamook Forest dating back decades. Hikers who had encountered something tall and dark watching them from the trees. Campers who'd heard strange vocalizations and found enormous tracks.
people who'd felt an overwhelming sense of being followed by something with malign intent. Most of these reports had been dismissed or rationalized away. Bears, elk, people's imaginations working overtime in the wilderness. But James had been there. He'd seen it. And he knew with absolute certainty that there was something in Tillamook Forest, something that didn't match any known animal, something that perhaps had been there for centuries, living in the deepest parts of the forest where human beings rarely ventured. He never guided another trip into Tillamook Forest. He still works as a wilderness guide, but only in other areas now. And he's careful about where he takes people. When potential clients ask him about Tillamook State Forest, he tells them it's beautiful, but recommends they stick to the popular trails near the visitor centers. He never explains why. How could he? Who would believe him? Late at night, James sometimes thinks about that creature pointing at his tent in the darkness, and he wonders what would have happened if he'd turned on his headlamp, if he'd confronted it directly instead of hiding. He's grateful he never has to find out. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some parts of the forest are better left unexplored. And some things that walk in the deep woods are better left to the shadows where they belong. And there you have it. 3 tales from the dark heart of Oregon. 3 encounters with things that shouldn't exist but do. From the depths of Crater Lake, to the haunted heights of Heceta Lighthouse, to the primordial shadows of Tillamook Forest, Oregon holds secrets that most people never glimpse. But now you know. You know that beneath the postcard perfect scenery lies something far more sinister. You know that when you venture into the wilderness, you're not always alone. And you know that some places demand respect, not because of park regulations or safety concerns, but because they're home to things that were here long before us and will be here long after we're gone. The question now is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you dismiss these stories as fiction, as campfire tales meant to thrill and entertain? Or will you remember them the next time you're planning a trip to Oregon, the next time you're hiking alone in a dense forest, the next time you hear strange sounds moving in the darkness outside your tent? These stories are warnings wrapped in nightmares, reminders that for all our technology and civilization, we're still just visitors in a world far older and stranger than we'd like to admit. The people in these stories survived, but they were changed. They carry these experiences with them, a weight that never quite lifts, a knowledge that can never be forgotten. So the next time you're standing at the edge of a dark forest, or looking out over deep water, or hearing strange sounds in the night, remember Michael, remember Sarah, remember James. Remember that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that really happened. If you made it this far, you're officially part of the brave ones. Subscribe, drop a like, and comment which story terrified you the most, because trust me, there are more nightmares waiting to be told. Sweet dreams, if you can.